Needs improvement. Needs improvement.
Finish this, go home, so let's start cleaning. Yeah. I'm gonna put some bleach in, give it an extra kick. What are you doing? Did you just run over here from 4 feet away?
But you guys are about to use bleach, and you're gonna mix chemicals.
This safety guy is so weird.
HazCom Training. HazCom Training.
OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard gives all of our associates working around hazardous chemicals the right to understand possible dangers and how to protect themselves. It is our responsibility that associates receive this annual HazCom refresher training to understand chemical hazards in the workplace, and that if new chemicals are introduced into our kitchens, that associates are trained on those chemical hazards as well. We must also deliver instruction on reading and understanding labels and safety data sheets, provide full access to safety data sheet binders, and provide the necessary personal protective equipment. Associates also have responsibilities which include understanding their rights under the HazCom standard and knowing where and when to seek out information about hazardous chemicals, also learning to read and understand the labels and safety data sheets, and using safe work practices and PPE when working with chemicals. Chemical hazards could be classified as health or physical hazards. Examples of these could include a compressed gas canister exploding in someone's hand, a flammable chemical starting a fire and causing burns, a corrosive chemical splashed in someone's unprotected eyes or on their unprotected skin, or a poisonous chemical accidentally ingested causing damage to bodily tissues and organs, just to mention a few. So consider these routes of entry into the body, which are by ingestion through the mouth, through direct contact with the pores of the skin or the eyes, and through inhalation by the lungs. When selecting chemicals to approve for use, we seek only to provide chemicals that, when properly used, would not off-gas toxic fumes or vapors and would not require the use of a respirator. OSHA further categorizes chemical hazards into 9 hazards symbolized by graphic pictograms. These pictograms can be found on both the chemical labels and within Section 2 of the Safety Data Sheet, also referred to as the SDS. These classifications are the health hazard, the corrosive hazard, the flame over circle or oxidizing agent hazard, the exploding bomb hazard, the flammable chemical hazard, the compressed gas cylinder hazard, the skull and crossbones, the environmental hazard, and the exclamation mark. It's important you become comfortable recognizing each one of these hazard types. It is required by OSHA that the chemical manufacturer and distributor ensure hazards are conveyed with information on the chemical label. However, once the chemical enters our kitchens, it becomes all of our responsibility that these hazards are understood. If ever a chemical label were to fall off, become torn, or for any other reason become too difficult to read, it must be replaced with the correct manufacturer or distributor provided chemical label. Let's take a closer look at what OSHA expects on a chemical label. Every chemical label must have the product identifier. This is essentially the name of the chemical, typically right there on the front of the bottle. Moving towards the back of the bottle, you'll find a signal word, such as danger for more severe hazards and warning for less severe. Also a hazard statement declaring general information regarding classification of the hazard. The pictogram, which as shown conveys graphical information categorizing the hazard. A precautionary statement which describes general recommended measures for prevention, response, storage, and disposal of a chemical. And finally, the name, address, and contact number for the chemical manufacturer. It is due to these strict labeling requirements that we should not have consumer-grade chemicals, or in other words, chemicals that could be purchased off the shelf in a supermarket, in our kitchens, as they are not regulated by OSHA and may not have all the necessary labeling requirements. If you come across an unlabeled, improperly labeled, or consumer-grade chemical in the workplace, do not use that chemical and immediately notify your supervisor. Non-compliant chemicals must be discarded accordingly. If you do find a chemical bottle missing a label, never try to identify the chemical inside by opening and smelling the contents. If there is any question as to the contents of the container, dispose of it immediately. If you have a desire to use a chemical in a secondary container, such as a spray bottle, plan ahead with your supervisor and request the proper labeling so it can be affixed to the bottle before placing the chemical inside. The only chemical container which actually does not require a label is a portable container whose intended purpose is for immediate use, such as a sanitizer or detergent pail, and when a floor wash is added to a mop bucket. So in practice, if you work in a kitchen and are tasked with handling a chemical, maybe you need to use a chemical to clean the floor or sanitize a piece of equipment, for example. Whichever the case, following this refresher training, the next time you handle each chemical, first read the label and the safety data sheet for that chemical. I would expect over time, reviewing this information, you will become familiar with each chemical, the hazards, and the necessary PPE, and will no longer need to read the label and SDS before each use. And that's okay. But it is always good to revisit that information following a break from work, such as after returning from winter or spring break. Also, anytime a new chemical is introduced, the label and SDS must be reviewed. Now, let's break down what makes up an SDS binder. Perhaps the binder in your kitchen was purchased at an office supply, or maybe your kitchen has already received a flashy new Diversity SDS binder. As long as it's a 3-ring binder with the correct front cover and contents, then it's compliant with OSHA. There must be a front cover identifying it as the safety data sheet binder. Inside must be a table of contents, which is the list of hazardous chemicals in the workplace which we discussed earlier. Beyond the table of contents are tabbed dividers and the SDS sheets. Each chemical SDS is unique, and a new revision of the SDS is released every few years, so verify that each chemical has the most current SDS available. In the inside front pocket of the SDS binder, place the information page, which states the purpose of the SDS binder and has a guide to the sections of an SDS. Keep a copy of the most recent HazCom Training sheet with signatures for each associate acknowledging they've understood the training. Finally, for me, the inside back pocket is the ideal place for the Emergency Eye Wash Station weekly inspection form, but if you prefer, this can be posted on the wall beside the eye wash unit instead, as long as the weekly inspection is happening and the form is initialed and dated. Templates for each of these forms is available on the My Compass safety page. At the start of each school year and during routinely scheduled audits, the SDS binder should be reviewed for compliance. A certification page is available as a tool for management to verify that the task of reviewing the binder is complete. Maintaining the SDS binder is a detailed endeavor, but critical to the understanding of HazCom for all levels of Chartwell's K-12 employees and management. The binder must be accessible and never stored locked inside an office or file cabinet. OSHA considers it a barrier of access if you have to go through a supervisor to view an SDS, which is why the location where the SDS binder is kept must be posted on the safety board in each kitchen. In an emergency situation, if chemicals are splashed in your eyes, you'll want everyone to know exactly where to find this quickly. Because contents of the SDS binder must include each chemical present in the kitchen, it is a good idea for management to discuss with the client about removal of any unnecessary chemicals, such as a can of paint left after a summer renovation, or janitorial chemicals stored in a kitchen closet. Other chemicals unnecessary for the SDS binder are those which no longer are on order and no longer available in the kitchen. Older SDS should be removed and discarded. Back to how things actually work in practice. You will not find every section of the SDS valuable to you. Do you need to know the percent composition of the relative density flashpoint permissible to the exposure limits of hexylene glycol? Probably not. But the SDS is the best place to understand what PPE is required for each chemical, so let's review an SDS together and discuss what is found in each section. Section number 1 identifies the chemical. If the product name here matches the name on the container of the chemical you'll be using, you're in good shape. Section number 2 identifies the hazards, but you'll notice there's more detail here than was on the label, so read carefully. Section number 3 is the information on chemical ingredients and composition. Section number 4 is first aid measures. If you're that person who doesn't wear PPE and thinks to yourself, well, I've used this chemical before and nothing happened then, or I'm just using it for a second, what are the chances? Then tell your supervisor and teammates right now to memorize the first aid section because you're a high-risk employee. Be responsible for your own safety and wear your PPE. They don't need that added pressure. Jokes aside, all operations are required to have at least one plumbed eye wash station that meets OSHA's minimum requirements. Eye wash bottle stations are intended only for supplemental use and must be used in conjunction with, not as a replacement for plumbed stations. Section number 5 is firefighting measures and lists suitable extinguisher techniques. Section 6 is accidental release measures and lists emergency procedures for large spill containment. Section 7 covers handling and storage, and you'll find important information here for you to review. Section 8 on exposure control and personal protection is quite possibly, along with Section 2 on hazards, the most valuable section of the safety data sheet for you to read thoroughly. Remember, there is no one-size-fits-all with regard to which chemical PPE to wear, because each chemical is unique, so follow strictly the required PPE listed in this section for the chemical you're handling. Section 9 covers physical and chemical properties. Section 10, stability and reactivity. Section 11, toxicological information. Section 12, ecological information. Section 13, disposal consideration. Section 14, transportation information. Section 15, regulatory information. And finally, Section 16 on other information. Here you can find the version date of the SDS to check that your binder has the most current copy. Now I went fast through those last few sections, but again, you'll find that after you've identified in section number 1 that you're reviewing the correct sheet for the chemical you're using, that sections 2 and 8 are the most valuable to you, and sections 4 and 7 should also be read closely. Following section 7, always store chemicals in designated storage areas, away from food, and never store chemicals in unapproved containers or without proper container lids. Containers should be sealed when not in use. And make sure you have put on the PPE before you open a chemical container. Once that container is open, you're handling that chemical and exposed to the hazards if something were to accidentally splash out. Inspect the condition of the chemical PPE in your kitchen and notify your supervisor immediately if damaged. Do not proceed to use the damaged PPE for handling chemicals. Gloves and aprons should be free of holes, nicks, or tears, and goggles should be clear of smudges and scratches, with a strap that is capable of being pulled tight to the face to prevent gaps. Face shields should raise and lower without struggle, and should also be free of smudges and scratches, and capable of being adjusted for fitment on your head. Because you're sharing chemical PPE with others in your kitchen, keep the equipment clean and sanitary. It is recommended that each unit is outfitted with a minimum of 2 sets of chemical-resistant gloves, goggles, and aprons. While the chemical-resistant gloves for general chemical usage are green in color, the chemical-resistant gloves selected for dishwashing or pot washing are a slightly different style, are blue in color, and have limited cut-resistant properties, so be sure to wear the right gloves for the right job. You may find it more desirable to wear a face shield instead of goggles while washing dishes to avoid fogging. My final word about chemical PPE is to store it on hangers readily available for its intended purpose. A set hanging beside the dishwashing area with the dishwashing gloves, and a set besides chemical storage with the green chemical-resistant gloves. Replacement PPE can be purchased on Supply America's website. It is everyone's responsibility to follow this training closely. Armed with this information, you will understand the complexity of OSHA Hazard Communication Standard and will keep yourself, your coworkers, and your company OSHA compliant and injury free.
To activate it, just turn on the cold water and pull the knob out. Then rinse your eyes out, make chemicals. Once a week, this should be inspected to make sure it's not obstructive and that the water flows freely.